I'm Gert. I'm a full-stack developer at Xebia. I use AngularJS in my daily work. I've been doing so for 2.5 years. And aside from that, I'm also doing Scala and Akka development. You can follow me at Hengeveld. And some of you might know me from my blog on AngularJS. It's called Opinionated AngularJS. I've written a few articles, especially one about authentication, which was pretty popular, amazing, actually. So you might have read one of those. Well, let's clarify something first. I'm going to be talking about domain model objects, or a domain object in short. And here's a definition. It's a logical container of purely domain information, which usually represents a logical entity in a problem domain space. I got that off the internet. Basically, what you're saying, you have a domain model, and it might look something like this. In this case, we have user, it's got a role, category, whatever. I also took this one off the internet. But basically what I'm trying to say is you have, when you're developing an application, you usually have some sort of domain that you're working in, and you're mapping that domain, you're architecting that domain. And in the backend world, we have all sorts of techniques to do this. We have domain-driven design. We have design patterns. We use models in our backend systems all the time. And we use object-oriented design approaches to structure that model. Well, I'm going to show you how you can do this in your AngularJS application, because there's no reason why you shouldn't do also the same structuring in your client-side application, unless, of course, it's a really simple application. But we're also using AngularJS at Xebia for developing enterprise-scale applications, like really big AngularJS applications, and you really want to to have your front-end developers, or if you're full stack, you want to have your whole team talk about the same objects, with the same names, so everyone knows what you're talking about. In domain-driven design, this is the ubiquitous language that you might know about. Well, let's talk about some difference between a domain model and a view model. In AngularJS, we have the view model, which is known as scope. And it's, well, basically a flat, a big tree of data with some logic attached to it. Well, it's not the same thing as your domain model, because your domain model exists of, rich domain objects, which can contain a lot of information, which is related to the specific domain that you're developing for. Well, a view model is just a data representation. Often you get in some data via an API in JSON form, and it can contain anything, any bunch of data. And some of it is part of your actual domain, while others is just purely for technical purposes that it's in there. With the domain model, we use an object-oriented design approach, like I just explained. While the view model is only, it's the structure that it has, it follows the view, aka the DOM, your HTML template. So usually you will structure your view model according to your HTML template. Well, that's obviously not ideal with the domain model. Your domain model, like I said, it's the place to put your business logic. Obviously, you have business logic in your application, and you do not want to intermingle this logic with technical details about how in this case, AngularJS works. You don't want to mix those two up. And I've seen it happen a lot of times that we have a controller and it's got a bunch of functions in there, but those functions do something, which is really specific to your domain. Well, then don't put it in your controller, put it in your, your model, which I will show. The view model, then again, it's got technical features such as two-way view binding. Domain model, it's got high cohesion. You should always use your every expertise that you've got from developing Java applications for years. Just use high cohesion and low coupling and stuff like that. And all those they also apply in your client. Well, the view model, it's got low cohesion because your scope is just a bag of data. You can put anything in there, and it doesn't necessarily have to relate to each other. Because just the fact that two types of information are displayed on the same page next to each other does not mean that they're related to each other. Only your UI. Your domain model, it's usually implemented using classes, while your view model, it's just plain objects. Of course, AngularJS makes a little bit more out of it. It adds a lot of stuff, but it's not a clean class in that sense. Your domain model then often mirrors your server-side. It doesn't necessarily have to be exactly the same as your server-side domain model, but usually it will mirror it for the most part. While your view model obviously is only in your client, only lives there. Well, how you do this? How can you implement this? Just add a little bit of class. Well, classes. JavaScript classes, let's talk about that. This is how you create a class in the ECMAScript 3 style. Just a function with a capitalized name. And well, in this case, it has 3 properties: ID, first name, and last name. It's the simplest model I could think of. And you can construct it like this. So, for example, I create myself a user, and obviously I'm lead, and well, my first name and last name. That's how you instantiate an object in a class in JavaScript. Well, we can really easily Angularify this thing by just wrapping it in a factory or a service. It's basically an alias for a service in AngularJS. And here I create a user model function. Oftentimes, a lot of people just use an anonymous function. I prefer to name these things, so I can untangle those as well. This style here, that the user model function is defined underneath, is actually from the John Papa style guide that I really recommend you read. But anyway, finally, I have my class here, and I return the constructor. That function there, it's the constructor, the function user is constructor, and I return that. And then if you want to instantiate one, well, the instantiation is actually exactly the same, but now you have it in your AngularJS dependency injection system. So you can use injector.get and get it from the injector, or just most of the time you will inject it into a controller, into a service, into whatever, other models actually. You can inject it there. A nice thing about about classes is you can add methods. So this is a really good place to add your business logic inside this class. In this case, I add a getFullName method onto my object, onto my instance. So this thing just concatenates the first and last name. It's really dumb, obviously. In this case, I also use a validate. This is a static method. This way you can implement those, and we'll see where it's used later on. It just validates that all the 3 properties that I expect are actually there. Another type of static method is factory methods. User build and user from JSON are both static methods that you can just call from any place. If you've injected user. And from a bag of data, wherever it came from, it's just a plain JavaScript object. That data, I map it to a user. So I create a user based on those properties. The same thing I can do with the from JSON. And basically it does the same thing, but note the argument name, or the property names in the data. It's first underscore name rather than first name with camel case, or what was it, kebab case, I heard. This is a really nice thing because you can centralize the mapping between the JSON representation and your internal representation of classes. So if, for example, your API changes, some property gets renamed, you can just change it in one place, and you don't have to change it throughout your entire client application. That kind of mapping can really easily be done right here. Also, obviously, if you put certain type of data here, you can map it to, for example, I want to make sure that it's an integer, then do parse int right there. Or in your constructor, you could also do it there. Kind of depends on what you want, what you're after. And of course, I also want to validate that the JSON is correct, what I'm expecting. So if it's not valid, I'm not returning anything here. Also up to your own implementation. Where things get interesting is response mapping. Normally, you could just use http.get on /users resource, and well, in this case, I say it will return an array of user objects. But JSON does not have a sense of classes. You don't have classes in JSON, it's just objects. So what this thing would return is an array with object, 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 etc. And these objects are simply a dumb bags of data, which we cannot rely on these objects. Our API might change, or if we use an external API, it's even worse. Then it gets really hard to keep track of everything. So response mapping, we just add then a callback method, or when the promise gets resolved, we map the response that we get, response data in this case, to a user. And nice thing about functional programming, we take the user from JSON factory method, and we just give it as the callback method to the map function in JavaScript. Obviously, if you need to support all the browsers, you probably have to use Lodash or something. But I went with the easy one. I just used the native map method. And finally, well, like I said, the from JSON, it will reject things if they're not valid, which means it will return undefined. So the filter boolean here, it means throw out everything that's undefined, or actually everything that's falsy. But since objects are truthy in JavaScript, we will end up with just an array of users. So it's a user list. This also means this user has the methods that we would expect it to have. So we don't have to check it in other places. We will know for sure. If you extend this model, obviously you want sometimes you have a nested JSON structure, or actually quite often. So your user might also have a location property. And a location could be a geo-location, geo-JSON kind of representation, if you use kind of stuff like that, or whatever you put in a location. In the build method, or from JSON, same thing, we can map it to the build. So you chain the thing. I build a user, and then I build a location to create that user. So this way you can make sure that your entire tree of data is consisting of your models. So this means I now have a user with 3 strings properties, the ID, the first name, last name, and the location object. And nice thing with objects like this, you can do a type of check to make sure that it's actually a location. Or an instance of check, sorry. Well, what else can you do with this thing? There's plenty of possibilities. You can do all your object-oriented design patterns. You can use them here. But I'm going to go into a few specific cases. This is a nice one. Let's say we create 2 users, but they have the same ID. I create X and Y, scope X and Y. I build 2 users, both have the same ID, the same properties. But if I then try to compare the two, so scope X equals scope Y, that will return false, because they're not the same object. They have the same properties, but they're not actually the same objects. That also means that in AngularJS, if you use ngModel on X and Y, the two are not in sync. So you type in one, and it does not change in the other place. Which is weird, because you would think it's the same object, at least in the contextual sense, in that way. Well, with caching, you can prevent that. So understand this is a different type of caching than the caching that you use to prevent HTTP requests all the time. Eh? It's a different kind of caching. It's not for performance. Well, it's not for performance reasons. AngularJS has a nice cache factory service that we can use. to when I create in the constructor of a user, I build it and then I put the user into my cache with its ID as the cache key. And then if I call the build factory method, first I try to get that user from the cache based on its ID. And if it doesn't exist, then I will create a new user. And only then I will create a new user. This means that if I build the same user with the same ID twice, I will also always get the first result back. So you get this thing. Scope equals y. And if I do x.firstname and y.firstname, those two fields will be in sync. They will be synchronized, and AngularJS will just pick it up. Little extra benefit, it's slightly less memory usage because you reuse the same object. But well, that's for specific cases. Then the for the power users, well, usually I would recommend don't do inheritance in JavaScript because it gets complicated really quickly and it's really it's not understood very well by most developers. So you would have to have a team of professional, really experienced JavaScript developers to make sure everyone understands what's going on. But you can, of course, do inheritance. But the saying goes, do aggregation over what is it? I forgot it. Try not to use inheritance that much, but make sure that it has the same properties. You can also, I can understand most of you are thinking, what, you're using http.get? Why are you using http.get? We got resource, right? Angular resource is really convenient for a lot of things, but it's not convenient for creating models. It's just a fancy wrapper around HTTP. But of course, if you want that convenience, just inherit from the user resource, create a resource as you are used to, and then in your model, you can just inherit the prototype of that resource onto your user model. So all that update method that I defined there will be available on my user model, as I would like to. Well, wrapping up. What else? Well, this is what we looked at, actually. Main features, object construction, you can control what your object will finally look like, do mapping, parse int, everything like that. It's the best place to put your business logic. Don't put your business logic on your controller. Put your business logic in your model. It's a much better place because you can much easily reuse it, and otherwise you'll get a tangled mess. Well, prefer, that is it, composition over inheritance. Prefer composition over inheritance. You can do that really easily. It's nesting. You can do validation, ensure that everything you get from your API is in good shape. And we can do JSON mapping, actually back and forth. So also when you are posting a JSON object to the server, you can do the mapping also in your model. What else? Well, then it's the power features. If you want inheritance, of course you can do that. You can do caching. You can inherit from resource. And that's it. Well, not really. There's a lot more you can do, but I won't go into that. Thanks.